Hey there, everybody. Coach Mark here. And before we dive into today's topic, make sure to find me over on Instagram as Coach Mark Estrubio. Also, I offer one-to-one coaching. It's what I do full-time, and the odds are very good. I'd love to work with you. But with that being said, let's get into it. So it's definitely been a hot minute since I've done a longer form video like this. I'm excited to be back, and quite the video I'll be doing today. I'm going to be talking about my athlete Henry Millard, who recently competed at World's Strongest Teenager online strongman games and took first place. So Teen Worlds was comprised of 4 events as opposed to the usual 5 that you'd see in a strongman show, and they were as follows. The first one was a log ladder, so you had logs ranging from 155 to 245, fastest time or most logs wins. Then it was a timber frame carry, 500 pounds, 50 feet down, 50 feet back. Then a 4-bar deadlift ladder, and it is worth mentioning the last bar was a Kratos deadlift bar, which I'll talk a bit more about later in the video. And then last but not least, a sandbag steeplechase, which consisted of 3 bags, a 200 and then a pair of 225s. You carry the bags 25 feet and then load them over a 48-inch high bar. Now, as far as Henry goes, when we started working together, he was already had a really good base of overall strength and athleticism. Really, one of the biggest things we did in terms of his training was simply getting a more structured approach lined out with sensible progressions. As a younger athlete, one of our big foci with Henry is not just hammering max effort week in and week out. This is something that a lot of younger lifters tend to be guilty of, is just always pushing for a new max. And even in a conjugate program, you don't necessarily strain for a 1RM every single week. Check out my Conjugate Codex series for more on this. But ultimately, we wanted to build a wide, resilient base of general physical preparedness, and this included integrating in movements such as plyometrics as well as mobility type exercises. So this is something I'll talk about in every single athlete competition write-up video, is the idea of square pegs and round holes when it comes to peaking. Because when you are peaking for a show, you are functionally jamming a square peg into a round hole. You, the athlete, need to adapt to the demands of the show. Whereas in the off-season, what we're trying to do is build the best possible square peg for yourself. The training adapts more around you. And the idea with the off-season is we build you all around more resilient and more capable so you could handle the rigors of competition-specific preparation. Now, as far as how the training went, his split was pretty basic, 4 days a week. We had a heavier pressing day, a heavier deadlift plus sandbag work day, then a full body day consisting of either paused or slow eccentric front squats, strict press, and then upper back work. And then last but not least, we had a lighter deadlift day, trap bar carries, and sandbag loading. Henry does train out of his home gym, so we were a bit limited in terms of equipment selection, but obviously we had everything we needed to get the job done. Now, the first event was that log medley, like I discussed. As far as training for it, day 1 was our heavier session with a big focus on singles and doubles. We wanted to build good, consistent repeatability nearing limit strength. And then on day 2, we did a lot of Viper pressing type work. And this was the 3rd day of the training week, but his 2nd day of upper body training, right? And the idea here is the Viper press was done specifically to help cue speed while also building in just a little bit of conditioning. Comparatively, we didn't do a ton of volume on the 3rd day of the week / 2nd upper body training session because he needed to recover in between his heavier deadlift session as well as his event training day. So for example, his first session of the week, you might have done 10 singles on the log, then some 6s on a strict log, slow eccentric floor presses, windmills, Lou raises, and then overhead triceps to finish. And then his 3rd training day of the week would be slow eccentric front squats, Viper presses, a seated barbell overhead press, barbell rows, and skull crushers. I want to talk a little bit about that slow eccentric floor press for the strongman athlete. This is honestly one of my favorite variations to use in a peaking phase in particular, because as we know, the floor press is incredible for tricep strength, and it's also very easy on the shoulders. And by integrating in a slow eccentric, what that does is it helps us milk that weight so we can get more benefit from it without having to go as heavy, which helps reduce overall fatigue, right? Just controlling that weight down. It also helps them keep it in a more tight groove. And if you think about something like a log, just being able to control it coming down from a little bit before you dump it can be very helpful because depending on the show, they may not let you do a full drop from overhead. Our 2nd event was the frame carry, and as far as training this, the accessory work was pretty bog standard. We did a lot of rows, shrugs, and typical core work. Trap bar carries are what replaced the frame. It's one of those situations where it was close enough. So how this would typically go is he would do some deficit deads, then he'd move into some carries, and one of the big things we had were time cuts, trying to keep his times anywhere between 8 to 12 seconds, depending on where we were in the training phase and how heavy we were going. And then after that, he would move into some sandbag work. Our third event was the deadlift bar series, and what we did here is we treated this essentially as a 1 rep max block pull, as those Kratos bars have a lot of whip in them, so it's more like a block pull than a true floor pull. One session a week we did focus on floor pulls, and then we also did block pulls after, and then the other session we would do some lighter deficit deads to help retain floor speed, as well as train explosive intent, and also just sort of prime and warm him up for stuff like the frame carry and sandbag work thereafter. So for example, on his first lower body day, we do some floor pulls, a heavy single on the block pull, sandbag work, shrugs, chin-ups, and curls, and then on the fourth day of the training week, his second lower body training day, we do some deficit deads before moving into the other events. The fourth and final event was the sandbag steeplechase. As far as training here, it was a fairly standard procedure. Again, we focused heavily on efficient picks as well as some speed drills such as the sandbag heart shock, which honestly is one of those things I think every strongman athlete should be doing at some point in their training year. It is such a good protocol. If you're not familiar with that, the idea is you take a sandbag, you start standing next to it, you run 50 to 60 feet away from it, you run 50 to 60 feet back to it, and then you carry it, right? That's 1 repetition. And then also we did slow eccentric front squats as well as paused front squats. And the slow eccentric front squat is particularly valuable here because it helps with upright body position alongside frontal loading, reducing low back fatigue. But most importantly, those slow eccentrics as well as pauses, they help absorb and redirect force, like braking when you're decelerating from trying to grab a new bag, right? You're sprinting back, you got to slow down and grab the next bag. Your body needs to be able to absorb and redirect force, not just generate force. A triphasic block is something that I think a lot of strongman athletes would really benefit from. If you're wanting to know more about triphasic, let me know. I can do a whole video discussing the modalities. But as far as his training goes, after his heavy deads, for example, we might do something like 8 sets of 2 every minute on the minute sandbag extensions just to help with his pick and load mechanics. And then on his other day, after doing his deficit deads, we might have done some heart shocks or loading and extending work, just depending on where he was in the training week. So ultimately, Henry won with 18 total points. Second and third place tied with 15 points, with second place being decided via countback. Henry himself was first or second on every single event, and it's worth mentioning, on the sandbag steeplechase, he won by 14.63 seconds. And you'll see here, this is what a sample week of training looked like for him. So day 1 was our heavier pressing day. 3S FP just means 3-second eccentric floor press. And then you'll see day 2, we did some deads off the floor, then some block pulls, sandbag work. Day 3, eccentric front squats, viper presses, then some overhead presses and rows, skull crushers, and then the last day was our lighter deadlift as well as moving event training day. Overall, a pretty cohesive training week, but nothing very complicated. Now, overall key takeaways here, first and foremost, you don't need to get that complicated when it comes to your training in general with a good peak. It's a fairly basic process. You're just slowly ramping up to be ready for the competition or over the competition, right? Because there is a very narrow level of focus, you really need high specificity and low variability. You just need to maximize carryover. And this is, for example, with the squat, we picked an accessory squat, the triphasic front squat, because that maximized carryover and minimized fatigue. And ultimately, you don't need to redline every single day in a peak. If your peaking PRs are better in training than they are come competition day, I think you could actually make the argument that your peak was insufficient and poorly timed. So that really covers the broad strokes of how we trained Henry to win the OSG for his division. So big congratulations to him for winning Worlds. It's just a huge accomplishment to be doing. And now we're moving into the off season and just working on overall general development. Hopefully you found something useful in this video. If there's anything you'd like to know more about when it comes to strongman or strength training, let me know down in the comments below. The best ones are ones I will turn into videos down the road. Otherwise, you folks have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you next time.